Cool. Y'all ready to do some Bible study? I am too. Okay. Go ahead and turn in your Bibles to Matthew 14. At least I think that's where we're at today. If we're not, you're either going to hear it again or we're going to be ahead a little bit. But we're getting Matthew 14 today. Okay, so a little recap, little review. Up to this point in Matthew, Jesus has been doing a lot of things, but he's been doing a lot of three specific things. What are they? He's been doing miracles, so he's been healing. He's been teaching and preaching. Yeah. Oh, man, look at y'all. Y'all remember it. All right. So last week in Matthew 13, chapter 13 was full of what? It was full of parables, wasn't it? Yeah, like we got a bunch of different parables. And all these parables were about the kingdom of heaven, right? And our response to the kingdom of heaven. And one of those crucial parables that he talks about is the parable of the sower. And in that parable of the sower, he describes four types of soil that represent four different kinds of hearts, right? So you've got you've got the hard heart that rejects the gospel. You've got the superficial heart. So the superficial heart shoots up real fast, but it dies out quickly because it has no roots, remember? You've got the divided heart that ends up getting choked out by the world and wealth. And then you've got the receptive heart, right? That's the good soil, and it actually produces good fruit because it has good roots. So now in Matthew, he's going to do something real cool where now he's going to give us 4 examples in chapter 14 of each of those heart responses. And I'm not going to straight up tell you what those 4 examples are. I actually want you to be looking for them as we go through this. And then at the end, I want to see if you caught them all. So, don't fall asleep on me because there will literally be a quiz at the end. All right, so you've been warned. You've been warned. Okay, so there's a lot that happens in chapter 14, a lot to digest, so we're just going to walk through it. But as we go through it, there's one main idea that Matthew is trying to get at us in chapter 14, and it's that what we believe about Jesus determines how we worship him. Let me say that again. What we believe about Jesus determines how we worship Jesus. So in this text here, we're going to see 2 categories of people that everyone on earth falls into, basically. There's those who believe in Jesus. So these are the people that, they believe he is who he said he was, and he did what he said he did. And then there's those who don't believe, right? The unbelievers. So these are people who don't believe he was who he said he was. They don't believe he did what he said he did, and they end up rejecting him despite the evidence that he gave. And we see these 2 examples in this text, but both of these categories still stand today, don't they? Like there's 2 types of people in the world. There's saved sinners and there's lost sinners, right? Everyone's a sinner. We're all sinners, but the difference in where they differ is what we believe about Jesus. And we can see what we believe about Jesus by the way we worship Jesus. That's the evidence there. So the first example we have of unbelief, we have to actually go back to the end of chapter 13, and it comes from Jesus' hometown. Jesus' hometown. So read with me at the end of chapter 13, verse 53. It says, when Jesus had finished these parables, he left there and went to his hometown and began to teach them in their synagogue, so that they were astonished and said, where did this man get this wisdom and these miraculous powers? Isn't this the carpenter's son? Isn't his mother called Mary, and his brothers James, Joseph, Simon, and Judas? And his sisters, aren't they all with us? So where does he get all these things? And they were offended by him. Jesus said to them, a prophet is not without honor except in his hometown and in his household. And he did not do many miracles there because of their unbelief. So Jesus goes back to his hometown here, and we assume by what they said, he's acting a bit differently, right? Like he's teaching with wisdom that they've never seen him do before. He's healing with power apparently they've never seen him do before. And they're like isn't this Joseph, the carpenter's boy? Like we saw him grow up. Like, why is he doing all this? He hasn't had this kind of education. And the key word to see here in this verse is in verse 57, he says, they were offended by him. That word there, offended, is translated from the word we get scandalous, from the word scandalous. And it means that they were like so put off by him that they were just like there's something like morally wrong with this guy and the things that he's saying. Like they were just offended by the things he was doing and saying. But what's so sad about this situation is that of all of the people that Jesus spoke to and all the people that saw Jesus, even his hometown did not accept him. Three observations from this little passage right here I have for you. They heard his words, they saw his work, yet they denied him worship. They saw it, they heard his words, they saw his works, yet they denied him worship. And that's still true to this day, isn't it? Like so many people see the evidence of what Jesus has done and they hear about his goodness, yet they still deny him the worship that he deserves. Well, the second example of unbelief comes from Herod the Tetrarch. So read with me in chapter 14 at the beginning. We'll read all the way through verse 12. At that time, Herod the Tetrarch heard the report about Jesus. This is John the Baptist, he told his servants. He has been raised from the dead, and that's why miraculous powers are at work in him. Verse 3, for Herod had arrested John, chained him, and put him in prison on account of Herodias, his brother Philip's wife, since John had been telling him, it's not lawful for you to have her. Though Herod wanted to kill John, he feared the crowd, since they regarded John as a prophet. When Herod's birthday celebration came, Herodias' daughter danced before them and pleased Herod, so he promised with an oath to give her whatever she asked. Prompted by her mother, she answered, give me John the Baptist's head here on a platter. Although the king regretted it, he commanded that it be granted because of his oaths and his guests. So he sent orders and had John beheaded in the prison. His head was brought on a platter and given to the girl. Who carried it to her mother. Then his disciples came, removed the corpse, buried it, and went and reported it to Jesus. So here we see a guy that the text calls Herod the Tetrarch. He also went by Herod Antipas. This is actually the son of Herod the Great, who we see in the Nativity story, actually that tried to kill Jesus as a baby. You remember that? This is his son, Herod Antipas. But in this passage, Matthew takes a second here, and he gives us some information about what's going on with John the Baptist. Like, remember, John the Baptist was put in prison a couple of weeks ago that we heard, and he starts, how John starts, having these feelings of doubt, and he sends his disciples to go ask Jesus, like, are you the promised Messiah that we've been waiting on? And so all we knew up to this point is that John has been in prison, right? Well, now we get a flashback to what ended up happening to John, basically, because Jesus is later going to find out, and we'll see his response to that here in the middle of chapter 14. But Matthew tells us this story here of how John was in prison because he, basically told Herod that, hey, you can't have your brother's wife like you do. And, she had a daughter who we assume was Herod's. And that's how he gets put into prison. Well, apparently, Herodias, the mother, did not like John in the slightest, right? Because Herod is having this big party, and we assume he's not in his right mind because he was very notorious for having these big debaucherous parties that he would invite a ton of people to. And I guess at some point he's having such a good time watching his daughter, we assume, entertain all of his guests. He's like, okay, I'll give you whatever you want. And she's like, okay. And then her mother, hearing that, says, oh, you should ask for John the Baptist's head. And so she does. And then Herod, he doesn't want to be embarrassed in front of all of his friends, and he wants to keep his word, even though, he didn't want that to happen, probably. He didn't want that blood on his hands. But he goes through with it, and he has John killed. He obliges her request. So why does Matthew think that this is important information to share with us? Because remember, there's nothing in here that the author did not intend to be in here for a very specific reason. Two reasons that he shares this story with us. One, it's a flashback to the prophet's persecution. A flashback to the prophet's persecution. All throughout the Old Testament, right? There were prophets who stood in the face of corrupt leaders and rebuked their sin. Remember, like John the Baptist himself was compared to Elijah earlier on in Matthew. And we know Elijah, remember, he confronted King Ahab and was persecuted for it. Well, now we see John stand up to Herod, and what happens to him? He's persecuted. So an application that we can glean from this passage is whenever you and I call out sin for what it is, we are usually always, it's always going to be costly to us. We're always going to receive some sort of persecution, but it will always be worth it. An author or writer once said that it's better to have a head like John's and lose it than to have a complacent head and keep it. So I thought that was pretty good. So we see a flashback to the prophet's persecution, but number two, we see a foreshadowing of Jesus' persecution. Foreshadowing of Jesus' persecution. So Matthew is linking John the Baptist and Jesus here, specifically in their places under Herod, in their treatment by Herod. In this instance with John, Herod plays a passive role in the death of John the Baptist. Whether he likes it or not, he has to kill John because he doesn't want to be embarrassed in front of his fans. So he doesn't say anything. He doesn't intervene for what he knows is right. He takes a passive stance. And in the same way, if you remember back to Jesus' trial, Pilate sends Jesus to Herod, doesn't he? And so what does Herod do in this instance? He doesn't do anything. He plays a passive role again with Jesus. So in both of those instances, he has a passive role in the death of John the Baptist and Jesus. So Herod is our second example of unbelief because it's his unbelief that will later have Jesus crucified. All right, so now Matthew is going to take a noticeable turn in chapter 14 from those who don't believe to those who do believe. More specifically, he's going to get real serious about the faith of his disciples. You can almost say like Jesus or like Matthew is saying, come in real close, right? So we just saw two examples of unbelief. Now we're going to look at two examples of belief. The first one is faith in the face of need. Faith in the face of need. Read with me in verse 13. Verse 13. When Jesus heard about it, he withdrew from there when he heard about John the Baptist. He withdrew from there by boat to a remote place to be alone. When the crowds heard this, they followed him on foot from the towns. When he went ashore, he saw a large crowd, had compassion on them, and healed their sick. When evening came, the disciples approached him and said, "This place is deserted, and it is already late. Send the crowds away so that they can go into the villages and buy food for themselves." "They don't need to go away," Jesus told them. "You give them something to eat." "But we only have 5 loaves and 2 fish here," they said to him. "Bring them here to me," Jesus said. Then he commanded the crowds to sit down on the grass. He took the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, and looking up to heaven, he blessed them. He broke the loaves and gave them to the disciples, and the disciples gave them to the crowds. Everyone ate and was satisfied. They picked up 12 baskets full of leftover pieces. Now those who ate were about 5,000 men, besides women and children. So here's the famous feeding of the 5,000, right? Like it says 5,000, of course, and then you get the fun fact, well, it was just 5,000 men, and it might have been 10,000 people or 15,000 people, like we don't know. But this is that story, right? So this is the only story that is recorded in all 4 Gospels, and each writer tells the story from a slightly different angle. So what has Matthew been trying to say about Jesus all throughout his Gospel? Like what identity is he trying to drive home about Jesus? He's the Messiah, right? He's the fulfillment of the Old Testament prophecies that Jesus is the promised Messiah. So the angle that Matthew comes at this story is he's giving emphasis to the effect it had on the disciples. The effect it had on the disciples. So Jesus does a lot of things to grow the faith of his disciples, and this is one of those times, and we'll see more and more from here on in Matthew. So as the disciples observe Jesus in this story, their faith begins to grow in several new ways. The disciples learned here to reflect Jesus' compassion. Reflect Jesus' compassion. So at this point in the story, Jesus is tired, right? Like Jesus is obviously worn out from all the crowds following him and all the opposition that is growing against him. So he gets into a boat and he leaves so that he can be alone, right? Wait a second. Am I too far ahead? No. This is the right story. Yep. Okay, so despite his best efforts, right, to get away, the people in the crowds, they still find him. And notice what Jesus did not do whenever the crowds found him. He did not say, like, would y'all please get away from me for 5 minutes, right? Like, let me take a nap or something. He doesn't say that. Instead, it says in verse 14, he saw a large crowd and had compassion on them. Like, this is that same compassion. This is that same word that Brother David talked about a couple of weeks ago, where like you're physically hurting, like almost sick to your stomach. Like he cares so much for these people. So the disciples are, of course, seeing this, and they learn to reflect his compassion. Secondly, they learn to rely on Jesus' resources. To rely on Jesus' resources. So in verse 15, you see that it's starting to get dark, right? And the disciples are like, hey, like we got to let these people go because, there ain't no food anywhere close by. And what they didn't know, and they were about to learn, is that they were with the bread of life himself, right? So Jesus turns to them and he's like, okay, well, you give them something to eat. And they respond, well, we've only got 5 loaves and 2 fish. So why in the world does Jesus say that to them? Like, why would he say that to them? He obviously knew that they couldn't feed all these people, right? Like, why would he ask them to do something impossible for them to do in their own power? But why does Jesus or God ever ask us to do anything that's impossible for us? So that we have to rely on his power to provide for us. The disciples were learning a very key lesson here, and it was to realize the sufficiency of Jesus in our lives. Like, he is sufficient in our lives in a couple of ways. First of all, Jesus meets needs in us. Jesus meets needs in us. The Jewish reader of this story, reading this in Matthew, is getting a ton of stuff out of this one story of the feeding of the 5,000. Whenever John tells this story in his gospel, he really emphasizes that Jesus is the bread of life. Like he says himself in John 6, 32 and 33, he says, "Very truly I tell you, it is not Moses who has given you the bread from heaven, but it is my Father who gives you the true bread from heaven. For the bread of God is the bread that comes down from heaven and gives life to the world." So the Jewish reader is seeing here that Jesus is also the better Moses, right? It was through Moses that God provided bread for Israel in the wilderness, but Jesus is now the sole provider of all of our needs. Next, the Jewish reader sees that Jesus is the greater prophet. Wasn't Elijah, the one who took the widow's jar of flour and her jug of oil and made it last all the way through the drought? Elijah was a great prophet, but Jesus is the better prophet here. Wasn't it Elisha, not Elijah, but Elisha, who fed 100 men with just 20 loaves of bread, right, in 2 Kings? Or with 20 loaves of barley. And Elisha was a great prophet, but Jesus is the greater prophet because he feeds, way more people here with way less food. But thirdly, the Jewish reader sees that not only is Jesus the better Moses and he's the greater prophet, but Jesus is the messianic host. Jesus is the messianic host. Jesus talked earlier in chapter 8 that there would be those who would recline with him and enjoy a feast in heaven. Remember, a feast for every soul that is hungry, that is trying to fill their stomach with the things of this world. Jesus invites us to taste and see that he is good. So the disciples are learning that Jesus is sufficient because he meets needs in us, but also he meets needs through us. Jesus meets needs through us. For, if all Jesus wanted to do here was to show his sufficiency, couldn't he just as easily called down bread from heaven and fed all these people? Like, he didn't need to use the disciples in this miracle, right? But that's not all he wanted to show here. He wanted to show that he meets needs through us, meaning that he meets other people's needs through us, right? Does that make any sense? Like, Jesus could have done the miracle all by himself, but instead he chooses to include the disciples in the work that he's doing. And he chooses to include the disciples in his miracle. Like, we don't really know how the miracle happened. We don't know how, just 5 loaves and 2 fish got, multiplied. But what we do know is that the miracle came from Jesus, but it was distributed by the disciples. Like, they took part in the miracle because Jesus wanted them to be involved in his work. And that is absolutely still true to this day. Like, we are called the body of Christ for a reason, right? Like, Jesus is still working and he's still doing miracles and wants us to be involved in that work firsthand. Like, he doesn't want us to just sit aside and wait for him to do it all. He expects us to get up and serve alongside him and to do his work. And I think that's just so cool because he doesn't have to do that. Like, he chooses to do that. He could just do it all on his own. He could, trust me, like, he would do a lot better job than I would, right? But he chooses to allow me to join him on the field and serve him and work with him and do miracles through me and do miracles through you. So the disciples learn to reflect Jesus' compassion. They learn to rely on Jesus' resources. But thirdly, to receive his blessing. To receive his blessing. What a blessing it is to serve alongside Jesus and see his miracles, firsthand. Like, that's such a blessing that those disciples got. Like they are right there, front and center in the middle of it. And even today, we get to receive the blessing of serving alongside the Holy Spirit and seeing him work in us and through us as he meets, not just our needs, but he meets other people's needs through us. So I think that's so cool. So faith in the face of need, that's our first example of belief. But our next example of belief is faith in the face of fear. Let's move on to verse 22. Faith in the face of fear. Immediately he made the disciples get into the boat and go ahead of him to the other side while he dismissed the crowds. Whoop, I got to turn my page. After dismissing the crowds, he went up on the mountain by himself to pray. Well into the night, he was there alone. Meanwhile, the boat was already some distance from land, battered by the waves because the wind was against them. Jesus came toward them, walking on the sea very early in the morning. When the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified. "It's a ghost," they said, and they cried out in fear. Very appropriate for Halloween. Immediately, Jesus spoke to them. "Have courage. It is I. Don't be afraid." "Lord, if it's you," Peter answered, "command me to come to you on the water." And he said, "Come." And climbing out of the boat, Peter started walking on the water and came toward Jesus. But when he saw the strength of the wind, he was afraid. And beginning to sink, he cried out, "Lord, save me." Immediately, Jesus reached out his hand, caught hold of him, and said to him, "You of little faith, why did you doubt?" When they got into the boat, the wind ceased. Then those in the boat worshiped him and said, "Truly, you are the Son of God." Okay, so another famous story here, right? Like, everybody, gets done eating, and Jesus is like, "Okay, it's time for us to head out." Basically, if you remember in John's gospel, whenever he gets to the end of the feeding of the 5,000, all the crowds and all the people are ready to crown him king, like right there. And Jesus is like, "Whoa, like, hold up, this is not how it's supposed to happen." So he's like, disciples, like y'all need to get out of here. I'm gonna go this way up the mountain, and I'll meet you guys on the other side. Well, the disciples are out there, and a massive storm comes up, and they legitimately think that they're about to die. Okay, so several things are happening here in this scene. I want to make 5 observations to the faith in the face of fear in this little story. The first one is to know that Jesus is sovereign over you. Jesus is sovereign over you. I have no doubt that Jesus orchestrated this whole scene. Like he knew exactly what he was doing the entire time. We see just by the way he was able to walk on the water that he was sovereign over the water. And then at the end, he completely commands the storm to stop. So the entire time that the disciples are out there in the wind and in the waves, Jesus was sovereign over them. So Matthew is trying to show us that we don't serve a God who is unaware of our trials. He's not unaware of our problems, but we serve a God who is sovereign over everything in our lives, especially the storms that we go through. Second, we see that Jesus is interceding for you. Jesus is interceding for you. Jesus prayed for his disciples all the time, didn't he? And I'm willing to bet that if he orchestrated this whole scene here, then when he went up onto the mountain, he was praying for the disciples while they were on the water. He was praying for the disciples while they were out there in the middle of the storm. Like, we can look at our trials and disappointments in life differently when we remember that Jesus is sitting at the right hand of the Father interceding on our behalf. He wants to give us strength. He wants to give us power through our trials, and we can know that we are not alone through them because Jesus is interceding for us, which leads us to number 3. Jesus is present with you. Jesus is present with you. Whenever Jesus walks out there to them on the water, they are terrified, and they basically think he's a ghost, right? And he tells them, have courage. It is I. Don't be afraid. And this reflects very closely to the language God uses in the Old Testament as his identity. I am, right? So Jesus is wanting them to know, hey, it's okay. The Lord is with you. God is with you out here. And it's so important for us to remember that since God is sovereign over our lives, then he is not going to abandon us in the storm. Instead, he wants us to know that, like Jesus wanted his disciples to know, that he is with us in the middle of our storms. And number 4, Jesus is strength in you. Jesus is strength in you. So Peter sees Jesus out there on the water, and he's like, okay, if it's you then, ask me to come out there to you. And then Jesus is like, come on. Like, yeah, I'd like to see that. And so Peter steps out of the boat and, now that, he steps out of the boat alone, which is awesome. We think that's pretty cool. And Peter actually starts walking on the water. But then it says that he starts looking around at the wind and the waves, and he starts to sink. So Jesus catches him, and he says, you of little faith, why did you doubt? Now, there's a tendency here for us whenever we read this little thing that Jesus says to Peter about Peter doubting, and we have a tendency to kind of dog on Peter for having little faith, right? But first of all, I don't see anyone else getting out of the boat. There were 12 of them, and Peter was the only one that got out. So he definitely had more faith in this instance than everybody else in the boat. But when we see Jesus here call Peter's faith little, we tend to think that faith is something we need more of so that we can succeed, right? And that's not what Jesus means here whenever he says little faith. Faith is not something subjective that we must create in ourselves. Sometimes we think like we're in charge of how much faith we have, and we need more faith, and we need to muster it up in certain situations. But Peter's faith was little because he moved the object of his faith off of Jesus. Even if it was just for a second, he takes his eyes off of Jesus and he looks at the wind and the waves. And the wind and the waves, they're not as big as Jesus, right? So he probably starts looking around because, even if it was just for a second, he thought he might be doing it on his own. So the point is that your faith is as strong as the object of your faith. And your faith is just as big as the object of your faith. And as long as your faith is in your circumstances or in other people or in your abilities or anything apart from Jesus, then our faith will always be little because everything is little compared to Jesus. So lastly, number 5, Jesus is peace around you. Jesus is peace around you. It's almost like a little quick passing note that Matthew throws in at the end of verse 32. It says that Jesus got in the boat and the wind ceased, as if to say, duh, right? That's what happens when Jesus is with you. There is peace. Jesus is the only one that can bring peace in the middle of our storms. And when we allow him to get into our boat and we place our faith in him, peace will always follow. I think that's so cool that he just throws it in there as an aside, like, yeah, that's what happens when Jesus gets in your boat. There's peace. Okay, so lastly, in verse 33, I want you to see the true picture of worship. Oh, read with me in verse 33. Then those in the boat worshiped him and said, truly, you are the Son of God. So this verse right here is the climax of this whole little chapter here, because this is the first time that the disciples address Jesus as the Son of God. This is the first ever time. Like we saw the Father call Jesus the Son of God earlier in chapter 3. We see demons call him the Son of God in chapter 8, but this is the first time that the disciples call him that. And it's because the disciples now truly believe he is who he says he is. That and now that they truly believe that, they give him the worship he deserves, or that he's always deserved. And that goes back to the main point of the whole chapter. What we believe about Jesus is how we worship him. What we believe about Jesus determines how we worship him. So we've reached the end, and I promised that there would be a quiz at the end, and I know you guys would just be heartbroken if I didn't fulfill that. Okay, so in chapter 13, he gives us the parable of the sower. Now in chapter 14, he gave us 4 examples of each of the 4 soils. I want to see if you caught them. So who is the hard soil that rejected the gospel? What was that? I can't quite hear you. Lost? The lost people? Okay. Those would be unbelievers. We had 2 of them at the beginning of verse 14. Who were they? Herod. Okay. Yeah, he's one of them. There's actually 2. What was that? Say again. The mother of the daughter. Okay. What about at the end of chapter 13? The people in Nazareth, right? The people in Nazareth didn't believe. Like they were examples of the hard soil that rejected the gospel. Like they heard Jesus, they saw Jesus, and they still denied him. They still denied him worship. Okay, so that was the hard soil. Who was the superficial heart that sprouts up real quick and then dies out quickly because it has no roots? Who's that soil? Say again. Peter? Not quite. Nope. The crowd. Yeah, exactly. I remember in other gospel accounts that this massive crowd kept following Jesus because he was feeding them, wasn't it? Like that was the only reason they were really following them. And then when he stopped feeding them, they up and left. Like they were gone. You talking about eating my flesh and drinking my blood, and we out of here. There's no real bread anymore. We're gone. Okay, so that was the superficial heart. Who is the divided heart that gets choked out by the world and wealth? This one's a bit of a trick question. You got to look closely. Peter? Not quite. So it is one of the disciples, but he's not explicitly named here in chapter 14. So Judas is in this story, isn't he? He's in this story. He's not explicitly named, but he's in there. He's with the rest of the disciples. He's partaking in the miracle on the mountain. He fed the 5,000 with Jesus. Like he saw Jesus and Peter walk on the water. He saw the calm of the storm. But when it came down to the end, if you'll remember, we'll see that greed and wealth ended up overcoming Judas, didn't it? And it choked out his faith in the end. So that was a bit of a tricky one. And lastly, we see the good soil. Who was that? The disciples at the end. Yeah, exactly. The disciples, because their faith was deepened through what they saw Jesus do. So thank you guys so much for having me teach this week. I hope you liked Matthew 14. I know I did. Looking forward to Matthew 15.